The Arabian Natufian origins of Semites. I'm going to use the four fields of anthropology to discover the origins of Semites. The four fields of anthropology are physical anthropology, archaeology, linguistic anthropology, and cultural anthropology. Understanding the origins of Afro-Asiatics and Semites is important because the ancient Hebrews of Israel are an Afro-Asiatic Semitic people. According to their genealogy, they descend from a man named Shem, Shem being the father of Afro-Asiatic Semites. The Israelites were a confederation of Iron Age Semitic-speaking tribes of the ancient Near East. Hebrew people are mostly taken as synonymous with the Semitic-speaking Israelites. So again, Afrasan, a large family of related languages spoken both in Asia and Africa. Semitic, a major branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family. Genesis chapter 11, verse 10 through 26 reads, "This is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. From Shem you get Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serg, Nahor. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram." Understanding that the Hebrews trace their lineage from Shem is important because this is a paternal line. Therefore, the best form of science to use will be a Y DNA chromosome. This is from Living DNA. What are haplogroups? Living DNA explain. The paternal haplogroup relates to your Y chromosome, and since that is a sex-determining chromosome, for men, it is passed down from father to son. This is the best way to trace the lineage of Shem, since according to the Hebrews, their lineage is from a male paternal perspective, starting from Shem to Arphaxad to Shelah to Eber to Peleg, Ru, Serg, Nahor, Terah, and then Abram. And then from Abram to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For the Arabian Natufian origin of Semites, we're going to use an old earth method. And this video will explain the old earth perspective. Before I play the clip, I want to make it known that I am protected under fair use. I'm using this video for teaching purposes as well as research purposes. I am protected under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107. Again, this is a copyright disclaimer. I am protected under fair use. I'm using this video for teaching and research purposes.
My name is Gerald Schroeder. I have a, thank God, a strong science background from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, bachelor's, master's, PhD, 7 years in the physics staff, seen a whole range of atomic bombs detonated, moved to Israel, met my wife, Barbara Sofer, a great writer, and then teach Torah and science. So luckily, I'm lucky that I have the two that come together. And one of the questions that I'm asked as a scientist is, how can a scientist really believe that there's something that we refer to usually as God? You know, is this metaphysical whatever acting in the world or producing the world? And the irony is, the question's really a non-starter. Science has in fact discovered God. And you can talk to the hardline atheists and they will say, it looks like science has indeed discovered God. And how would that be? Well, if you take the trouble of going to the web and there type in WMAP, the initials for a satellite, it's a diagram that shows the development of the universe from the creation over time. It's a timeline. Every word on that diagram comes from the NASA site. It is the condensed knowledge of the scientific community of how the universe created and how it got to where we are today. Each of the lines, the vertical lines, is another billion years. Okay, you start from a burst of energy at the extreme left side of the diagram, and you end up at the far end with the oval. The oval is to indicate expansion in all directions. Of course, because it's a timeline, we can't show that on a single piece of paper. We see here, most amazingly, that on the extreme left edge, it shows a beginning to the universe. Now go back less than 50 years. If I were teaching that at Tech, a person could lose tenure saying that there was a creation of the universe. It sounds like it's Bible. Because less than 50 years ago, the overwhelming scientific opinion was the universe is eternal. There was never a beginning. The Bible is wrong from the very first sentence. And then we discovered suddenly Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, the Bell Labs in New Jersey, the northeast of the U.S., discovered the echo of the Big Bang, the energy left over, which George Gamow, 60 years ago, predicted that if there had been a universe created hot and small, it would have exploded, and the energy would get more and more dilute. And Penzias and Wilson, these Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, discover this energy that had been predicted overnight. The Bible got it right. There was a beginning to the universe. Now, the black in the diagram is nothing. It's not a vacuum. Vacuums are within that diagram, within that cone of expansion. Vacuums are empty space, and space is something. The black of the paper around the diagram is nothing. It doesn't fit in our human brain because humans think in a box made of time, space, and matter / energy. No human, as clever as they might be, as expansive as they might be, thinks out of that box. So when we say outside that diagram is nothing, we can use the words, but we can't conceive of nothing. It doesn't fit in the human brain. How are we going to have this idea of is there a God or not? Notice that the creation force isn't the three-letter word G-O-D. If you look at the words carefully, it's a quantum fluctuations. That understanding was first brought down by Ed Tryon, brilliant human being, in the journal Nature almost 40 years ago. The universe allows creation of something from nothing, provided you have the laws of nature, the quantum fluctuation. Tryon realized, and he published in the journal Nature, one of the two leading peer-reviewed journals in the world, that you can create something from absolute nothing, provided you've got the laws of nature, quantum physics and the laws of relativity. In other words, the laws of nature. So look what science has discovered. We can create the universe from absolute nothing, provided we have the forces of nature. Now, the laws of nature, the forces of nature aren't physical, they act on the physical. So if they create the universe, that means they predate the universe. So now we have a set of forces, we call them the laws of nature, that are not physical, that are able to act on the physical. They create the physical from absolute nothing. And they predate the universe, which means they predate our understanding of time. Put that together, it sounds very familiar. If you haven't noticed it, that's the biblical definition of God. There's only one nuance that's left hanging. We can talk about it another time, perhaps. Is that which created the universe, those forces active in the universe. But up to that point, science says you are correct. The definition of the biblical God is predates time, outside of time. God is not a physical being, is a force, and it creates the universe. You'll notice at the opening chapter of Genesis, the only name for God is Elohim, God as manifest in the universe. Science has indeed discovered the biblical God, or we just need one part left, crucial. That which created the universe is also active in the universe itself. The very fact that you're watching this now pretty much establishes that point.
Old Earth creationism is a form of creationism which includes day-age creationism, gap creationism, and progressive creationism. Broadly speaking, Old Earth creationism occupies a middle ground between young Earth creationism and theistic evolution. So this is basically what an Old Earth is, and I have more videos that explain the concepts of an Old Earth if you check out my playlist titled Old Earth Creationism. Now let's get into the Arabian Natufian, or the Afro-Arabian, or the Arabian Peninsula Levantine origin of Semites. Some scientists, such as Hugo Winkler and Lionel Capitani, and many others, propose an Arabian Peninsula origin of Semites. I find this to be very interesting, especially when you apply this to genetics as well. But first, let's look at the various scholars who propose an Arabian origin of Semites. The Winkler-Capitani theory, named after its two most distinguished proponents, Hugo Winkler and Leon Cattani, claims that Arabia was originally a land of great fertility and the first home of the Semitic peoples. Through the millennia, it was undergoing a process of steady desiccation, a drying up of wealth and waterways, and spread of the desert at the expense of the cultivable land. The declining productivity of the peninsula, together with the increase in the number of inhabitants, led to a series of crises of overpopulation and consistently to a reoccurring cycle of invasions of the neighboring countries by the Semitic peoples of the peninsula. So again, Semitic populations were in the Arabian Peninsula, but they began to move because of various crises, such as the peninsula becoming more of a desert, and because of overpopulation and various other incidences. So it says, it was these crises that carried the Assyrians and the Arameans, the Canaanites, including the Phoenicians and Hebrews, and finally the Arabs themselves into the Fertile Crescent. So again, this is a migration from Arabia into the Levant and the Fertile Crescent. This theory has recently been replaced and significantly updated by Juris Zarins, who proposes that a Circum-Arabian Nomadic Pastoral Complex developed in the period from the climatic crisis of 6200 BCE, partly as a result of an increasing emphasis in Pre-Pottery Neolithic B cultures upon animal domesticates and a fusion with Harifian hunter-gatherers in southern Palestine, with affiliated connections with the cultures of the Fayum and the eastern desert of Egypt. Cultures practicing this lifestyle spread down the Red Sea shoreline and moved east from Syria into southern Iraq. And that migration sounds very similar and interesting because it's very similar to the Semitic migration from the northeast Africa / Levant region into Arabia and into the Fertile Crescent. So it's a very similar sounding movement. So this video will actually sort of demonstrate that very movement of populations in the Levant, but also in Arabia, moving more into the Fertile Crescent and deeper into Arabia. Before I play the clip, I want to make it known that I am protected under fair use. I'm using this video for teaching purposes as well as research purposes. I am protected under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107. Again, this is a copyright disclaimer. I am protected under fair use. I'm using this video for teaching and research purposes. So that right there was the spread of Proto-Semites, early Semitic populations from the Levantine Arabia region into the Fertile Crescent. And again, this would have happened in 4000 BC. And by the way, this proves haplogroup J as being Semitic in origin, considering that haplogroup J, the oldest sample we find in the Levant, is in 21,000 BC. So that's 2,000 years too late for it to be Semitic, whereas in this time period of 4000 BC, the Levant and Arabia would have been full of E markers. But we'll touch on that here in a second. So what I want to keep y'all, have y'all stay in mind is that the migration of Proto-Semites from the Levant Arabian region, and this is sort of how it would look. So let's get into some readings that deal with it. So this book, The Home of the Semites by John P. Peters. According to the prevalent view, the home of the Semites is Arabia, which has been like a seething cauldron, boiling over at intervals and admitting its surplus population in successive eruptions poured out as the lid was forced open. The first Semitic eruption from Arabia, according to the prevalent view, took place in the 4th millennium BC, as I just showed you, the 4th millennium BC, resulting in the establishment of the Babylonian Semites on the east and of the Semitic peoples in northern Syria on the west. The wave of immigration from Arabia divided by the desert pouring upon both east and west. So again, Semites coming out of Arabia, out of the Levantine Arabia region, going into the Fertile Crescent to become the ancient Babylonians, or the Akkadians in this case, as well as various Syrian populations. And as we can see, technically, according to this map, Proto-Semites would have also been in early Syria as well. And that is it from The Home of the Semites by John P. Peters. But here's another source that deals with that as well, the American Journal of Semitic Languages and Literatures. And it reads, "The view that seems to prevail is that in prehistoric time, the Semites broke forth from Arabia, their original home, and succeeded in establishing themselves in Babylonia, Assyria, and on northward and westward to the Mediterranean." And the video I showed you kind of illustrated that migration, starting from the Levantine Arabia, going into the Fertile Crescent. Here's another book detailing this, Man, Past, and Present by A.H. Kane. And it reads, "The first great wave of Semitic migration from Arabia is placed in the 4th millennium BC, 3500 to 2500 or earlier. It affected Babylonia and probably Syria and Palestine, judging from the Palestinian place names belonging to this Babylonian Semitic period, and the close connection between Palestine and Babylonia. So again, around the same time, around the 4th millennium BC, is when these Semites began to migrate out of Arabia into the Fertile Crescent. And this is from the historian's History of the World, and it reads, others, including Spengler, Scasey, Satriger, de Groget, Wright, and Brighton, contend that the Semites invaded Babylonia from Arabia. So those various historians and archaeologists basically all believe that the Semitic populations, early Semites, came from Arabia, and then they went into Babylonia, which would be the Fertile Crescent. So you have a lot of people that do believe this. This is from the Semitic migration from Arabia, and it reads, as for the history of these migrations and the name of the groups that carried them, the theorists believe that the first half of the 3rd millennium BC witnessed the departure of 3 human waves from the Arabian Peninsula, 2 of them towards the Mesopotamian Valley, and they are the Akkadian wave that settled in the southern region and mixed with the Sumerian element. And here is from World History, History of Migration, and it reads, when prehistory sheds into history, in the Middle East, there has already occurred the first identifiable movement of a people of tribes linked by their language, the Semitic tribes. Probably originating in southern Arabia, Semitic people have spread by 3000 BC along the desert cavern routes up through Sinai and into the Syrian desert. 500 years later, they are an integral part of the culture of Mesopotamia, where there is a great Semitic dynasty as early as 2350 BC. Semitic tribes are the first to bring civilization to the coastal strip of Palestine and Phoenicia. So again, Semites coming from Arabia. In this book, Arab Nationalism basically breaks things down perfectly. Whence come the Semites? Not from Central Asia, as it used to be asserted, but actually from the Arabian Peninsula. Winkler, an authority on the subject, is categorical. The home of the Semites, he affirms, is Arabia. Spengler, before him, also maintained that all Semites are Arabs. In successive eras, starting with the earliest antiquity under the pressures of overpopulation, Winkler, or more simply, of climatic variations, which caused persistent famine, their migration waves overflowed periodically in the neighboring countries, overwhelming the native populations or evicting them from their country of origin. 4 times in history, the Semitic wave broke its dam and spread outside. The first wave, called Babylon, is lost in the night of the time. It went in the direction of the Tigris and Euphrates Valley and reached northern Babylonia, where the Sumerians and Akkadians had to surrender. So again, it seems like these early Semites, which according to Winkler would have basically been Arabians, came out of Arabia because of a lot of climatic events, such as Arabia becoming more of a desert, and as well as overpopulation. And this sort of reminds me of why Semites came out of North Africa. Of course, there is a North African origin of Semites when the Sahara was green. And this Arabian origin of Semites kind of mirrors that North African origin of Semites. The reason that these Semites left their homeland is because these green, tropical, lush areas are starting to dry up and become a desert, so they're trying to find more fertile lands, and this leads them to the Fertile Crescent. So I find it very interesting how the Arabian model for the origin of Semites and the North African model for the origins of Semites kind of match each other. And North Africa and Arabia would have both been green at the same time. So here is a book, The Arabs in History. Perhaps the best known of this is the Winkler-Cattani theory, so named after its 2 most distinguished exponents. According to this, Arabia was originally a land of great fertility and the first home of the Semitic peoples. Though through the millennia, it has been undergoing a process of steady desiccation, a drying up of wealth and waterways, and a spread of the deserts at the expense of the cultivable land. The decreasing productivity of the peninsula, together with the increase in the number of the inhabitants, led to a series of crises of overpopulation and consequently to a reoccurring cycle of invasions of a neighboring countries by the Semitic peoples of the peninsula. It was these crises that carried the Assyrians, Arameans, Canaanites, including the Phoenicians and Hebrews, and finally the Arabs themselves into the Fertile Crescent. So all these ancient known Semitic populations, Akkadians, Ebolites, Assyrians, Arameans, etc. They all would have came out of Arabia into the Fertile Crescent. Again, this is the Arabian origin of Semites, and it's due to the drying of the peninsula, as well as overpopulation and invasion. So this is a very interesting model. So here is a map that shows you how it would have occurred. So here is the origin of Semitic peoples, the Arabian Peninsula in green. All of this would have been Semites, and then Semites would have came into the Middle East, or should I say the Near East, which will be up in this area, going into the Levant to become Canaanites, Phoenicians, Hebrews, and into the Fertile Crescent to become Akkadians, Assyrians, Arameans, just as I read. So this is the out of Arabia origin of the Semites. It's a very interesting one. What I find intriguing about the possibility of an Arabian origin of Semites is the genetic connection between Arabians and Natufians. This is from the genomic history of the Middle East, and it reads, Arabians and Bedouins are positioned close to ancient Levantines. When we substitute Levant Neolithic with Natufians as source of ancestry in the Middle East, we found that Arabians could be successfully modeled. So Arabians are genetically very close to Neolithic Levantines and Natufians. Arabians acquire additional ancestry from a Natufian-related population. This is from projecting ancient ancestry in modern-day Arabians and Iranians. A key role of the past exposed Arabo-Persian Gulf on human populations, and it reads, modern Saudi Arabian and Yemeni samples clustered tightly in the lower left quadrant, overlapping with the 3 Natufian samples, and were close to the Levant Pre-Pottery Neolithic B and Pre-Pottery Neolithic C and Levant Bronze Age samples. So modern-day Saudi Arabians and Yemenis are very close to Natufians and Neolithic Levantines. 2/3 of the West Arab-Persian population have ancestry shared with the Natufian, typical of the Levant. And so here is just a pie chart, or just a chart showing you when it comes to Levant PPNB, Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, who has this genetic fusion in them, and it is Yemen and Saudi Arabia who have the most. Natufians are an ancient Levantine population whom many scholars believe are the ancestors of Semites. This is why I think this is interesting. And Natufians also carried haplogroup E. This is from In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory, and it reads, this paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. This is from Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus reveals core of West Eurasian ancestry, and it reads, such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. So the Natufians, who may be the ancestors of Semites, they had E markers. Even when it comes to haplogroups, we can find a basal or an ancestral haplogroup E lineages in both the Levant but also in Arabia. Ancestral lineages of E are in the Levant and Arabia. This is from carriers of mitochondrial DNA, microhaplogroup L3 basal lineages migrated back to Africa from Asia around 70,000 years ago. That's the title of the paper. So the relevant portion is in yellow, and it reads, curiously, ancestral E star, that's what the star means, it means ancestral or basal, ancestral E star lineages have been detected in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. So I find this very intriguing that there could be an Arabian Peninsula origin of Semites, and there could be a Levant origin of Semites. And either way, we find ancestral lineages of haplogroup E in both locations, again leading to the credence of haplogroup E likely being the Proto-Semitic lineage. We even find Arabians to this day with old forms of haplogroup E. They have a lot of old strands of E within them. This is from the genomic history of the Middle East, and we can see that a lot of Yemeni samples, and again, Yemeni populations have genetic connections to the Natufians. Yemeni people have the highest Natufian ancestry, and they also have old forms of haplogroup E. And we also see Saudi Arabian and United Arab Emirates people with haplogroup E, more Yemeni, as well as Syrian, which makes sense, Yemeni, Saudi Arabia, and you find it in Bedouins in Negev, in Arab Christians in Israel. You even find it in Iraqi Kurds, Arab Christians in Israel. And so we see a lot of E samples, Iraqi, Palestine, even an Iranian, Bedouin in the Israel of Negev, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and you see it goes on and on and on. United Arab Emirates and Yemen. So we see a lot of old clades of E among these Middle Eastern populations who happen to have very close genetic ties to the Natufians. And so here's another chart that illustrates that. Natufians and Yemenite samples, or Yemenite peoples, we see these are the places where we got the samples, and here are the locations. And we see that Yemenites in these locations have 50%, 33%, 33%, 25%, 25%, 25%. And here's just a Y heat map of the Middle East, specifically Arabia, with a lot of high frequency of E in Yemen, which makes sense, and also in Arabia. And again, these peoples have the highest amount of Natufian ancestry. So, many of these Arabians with haplogroup E descend from the same branches of haplogroup E that the Natufians had. This is from DNAconsultants.com, and it reads, 3 of the individuals had Y chromosomes belonging to haplogroup E1b1, which likely originated in East Africa and is also found in early Neolithic farmers from Jordan. Natufian genomes also show similarity with modern-day populations in Saudi Arabia, as well as the Bedouin nomadic peoples of the Arabian Peninsula. Let me repeat that again, only reading what's in yellow. 3 of the individuals had Y chromosomes belonging to haplogroup E1b1. Natufian genomes also show similarity to modern-day populations in Saudi Arabia, as well as the Bedouin nomadic peoples of the Arabian Peninsula. That's exactly what we read. Bedouins and Arabian populations have the closest amount of Natufian DNA, and we also see old forms of E among them. So you can also check out FamilyTreeDNA.com, specifically titled Natufian DNA Y DNA Classic Chart. And basically what this will illustrate, I'll read. For genealogy within the most recent 15 generations, STR markers help define paternal lineages. Y-DNA STR markers change, mutate, often enough that most men who share the same STR results also share a recent paternal lineage. This page displays Y chromosome haplogroup, Y chromosome DNA, Y-DNA STR results for the project. It uses the classic format. The columns display each project member's kit number, paternal ancestry, information according to project settings, the paternal tree branch haplogroup, and actual STR marker results. So basically, what this is going to show you is the populations of people who have this Natufian-related ancestry from a Y-DNA chromosome perspective. So as y'all can see, hopefully, is that you find basically a lot of Iraqi, Yemeni, Palestinian samples with E markers. Here's Palestinian territory, Jordan, you see Lebanon, Yemen, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and such. And again, you can just type in family tree DNA, Natufian Y-DNA classic chart to see this. You can see a lot of Yemen, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, a lot of UAE, and you see a lot of Saudi Arabia, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, a lot of Iraqi samples with E markers, possibly descendants of Akkadians. You see Iraq and Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Yemen, and again Palestine and Bedouins and Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Lebanon, Yemen, Saudi Arabia. A lot of E markers. And again, Yemen and Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. You can see it all right here. This is the location. This is the haplogroup. And basically what I'm illustrating and I want to get across is that you find a lot of Middle Easterners with haplogroup E. It seems that a lot of people believe that the Middle East only has haplogroup J, and that's just not the case. Haplogroup E is extremely abundant in Middle Eastern populations. Here is a bunch of section with Iraq, haplogroup E, and these peoples with these E markers have the link to the Natufians. Here's a bunch of Lebanon of haplogroup E, again a bunch of Iraq, and here's a mixture of just Middle Eastern populations. Here's a bunch of Saudi Arabia with haplogroup E, Saudi Arabia. Here's a bunch of Oman, and again, the Middle East has an abundance of haplogroup E. And this are the people who are linked to Natufians, who are the ancestors of Semites. So from a genetic point of view, this all makes sense. If you break down Natufian autosomal DNA, they are, actually overwhelmingly Arabian. Also, keep in mind that this is ancient Arabian that the Natufians have, because the Natufians themselves are an ancient population. So here's the breakdown of Natufian DNA. The Natufian sample consists of 61.2% Arabian. That's the highest amount of DNA that Natufians have. It's mostly Arabian. Then they have 21.2% North African, which would be Ibero-Maurusian. Then they have 10% West Asian, that's just Middle Eastern, and 6.8% Omadic, which is East African. So, therefore, seeing this connection between Arabians and Natufians is very interesting, and it makes sense. Natufians are 61.2% Arabian. Arabians are genetically closest to Natufians. Both Arabians and Natufians have haplogroup E. Both Arabians and Natufians are seen as the possible ancestors of Semites, again, like I read with the Arabian origin of Semites. And of course, we all know the Natufian origin of Semites. And with all of that being said, it looks, when you look at the migration of Semites from more of a Levantine Arabian source, I feel like that's the best way to kind of put this together, to have it be more of a Levantine Arabian source for this migration of Proto-Semitic populations. Basically, Semites originating from the northern Arabia in the Levant. Does any archaeology support this model, though? Can we see this? Well, here is a really good paper, and I believe this is also a book. This is from Chicago Journals, and this is from, of course, a university, and it's titled Early Pastoral Nomadicism and the Settlement of Lower Mesopotamia. This is by Juris Zarins, and excuse me for any mispronunciation, but it reads, "The Akkadians' nomadic origins have generally been assumed. However, the conventional prehistoric archaeological picture fails to illustrate those origins and the Akkadians' involvement in Akkadia, or Akkad. Thus, the origins of pastoral nomadicism must be sought in the context of mixed farming within the Fertile Crescent, specifically during PPNB, Pre-Pottery Neolithic B." And understanding the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B culture is very important because it is basically the predecessors to Semites. So continuing, it says, subsequent expansion into marginal agricultural lands led to symbiotic relationship between pastoral and nomadic farmers. And pastoralism and farming is a very important element when it comes to Semitic culture, especially early Semitic culture, and I'll deal with that a bit later. And let's finish. It says, the Akkadians seem to have moved into the northern Arabian steppe or steppe and desert. And again, that's what I meant when I was saying earlier about the origin of Proto-Semites being in a more Levantine Arabian type of region, because as I just said, the Akkadians seem to have moved into the northern Arabian steppe desert, and so that's basically the Levant and Arabia. And during the mid-7th millennium BC, the PPNB, Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, and Pre-Pottery Neolithic C populations apparently began intensive herding at the end of that period and maintained ties to the Fertile Crescent, seen in both exotic trade and everyday culture. They began to penetrate into Akkad during the time under discussion. Archaeological sequences in the Arabian desert suggest that the Akkadians probably were a West Semitic Levantine background, and that's the main important thing that I want y'all to get. That archaeological sequences in the Arabian desert suggest that the Akkadians were probably of a West Semitic Levantine background. So again, we're seeing that Arabian and Levantine connection, and most evidence really is pushing to a Levantine origin of Semitic populations. And of course, the Levant for thousands of years was full of haplogroup E and the descendants of Natufian populations. And these Natufian populations also moved into Arabia, which is why you see a lot of Yemeni and Arabians with high amounts of Natufian ancestry. So it would seem like early Semitic populations, like the Akkadians, were in northern Arabia and the Levant, and then moved into Mesopotamia, much like that video that I showed you. And this is very similar, if not the same, as what the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis says about the Semites having a Levant origin. I'm going to read what's in yellow. Again, this is the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages, identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Near East, and it reads, we estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin 5,750 years ago in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. Again, a Levant origin of Semites. All evidence points to that, and Semite or Semitic populations were moving from the Levant into Mesopotamia, and the Akkadians are a great example of that. And the video I showed you illustrated that as well. So let's actually visualize this migration of Semites from the Levant / Arabia into Mesopotamia again. Before I play the clip, I want to make it known that I am protected under fair use. I'm using this video for teaching purposes as well as research purposes. I am protected under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107. Again, this is a copyright disclaimer. I am protected under fair use. I'm using this video for teaching and research purposes. As we can see, a perfect migration of Semites from the Levant/Arabia into Mesopotamia around 4000 BC. Now, the only other question is, who do these early Semitic populations like the Akkadians descend from? Let's return back to the paper because it actually tells us. So I'm going to read what's in yellow. Thus, the origins of pastoral nomadicism must be sought in the context of mixed farming within the Fertile Crescent, specifically during the PPNB. So PPNB, Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, seems to be important. Again, I'm reading what's in yellow. I'm right here. The Akkadians seem to have moved into the northern Arabian steppe and desert during the mid-7th millennium BC. The Pre-Pottery Neolithic B and Pre-Pottery Neolithic C populations apparently began intensive herding at the end of that period and maintained ties to the Fertile Crescent, seen in both exotic trade and everyday culture. Archaeological sequences in the Arabian desert suggest that the Akkadians probably were of a West Semitic Levantine background. So we're looking at pre-Pottery Neolithic B and C populations, more specifically pre-Pottery Neolithic B. So let's look into who these people are. So early Semitic populations descend from PPNB populations. Who are PPNB populations? Pre-Pottery Neolithic B is part of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic, a Neolithic culture centered in Upper Mesopotamia and the Levant. So that's the region that we're dealing with. Like the early PPNA people, the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B culture developed from the Mesolithic Natufian culture. So when we're looking at PPNB culture, it developed from the Mesolithic Natufians. And we know who the Natufians are, but let's just kind of go over them. The Natufian culture is a late Epipaleolithic archaeological culture of the Levant, dating to around 15,000 to 11,500 years ago. The culture was unusual in that it supported a sedentary or semi-sedentary population even before the introduction of agriculture. The Natufian communities may be the ancestors of the first builders of the first Neolithic settlements of the region, which may have been the earliest in the world. So the Natufians were early agriculturalists and they were early builders. So this is actually another paper that goes into the early Natufians. This paper is titled The Genetic Linguistics Inference, and it reads, the 2005 book, First Farmers, The Origins of Agricultural Societies by Peter Bellwood, provides an excellent resource for linguists who wish to explore the worldwide correlation between the origins of agriculture and the expansion of languages. Prior to the adoption of agriculture in Southwest Asia and elsewhere in the world, for that matter, the human tribe practiced hunter-gatherer techniques in order to survive. The evolution of agriculture in Southwest Asia generally follows a series of cultural transitions that begin with the Natufians, followed by the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A and Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, and then finally the development of pottery itself. The Natufians stand as an important cultural transition because they were the last hunter-gatherers in the Middle East. The Natufians appeared near the Sea of Galilee in what is now present-day Israel. So the Natufians were early farmers, early people who would begin farming. So here's the area of Natufian culture. Basically, they stretch from Sinai all the way up into Syria. And here's the distribution of sites, PPNB sites. Again, it's pretty much the same geographical region because PPNB people are basically Natufians. They start down here from, I guess, the Negev, or, Sinai, because basically right here, all the way up into Syria. So it's the same region. So work at the site of En Gazel in Jordan has indicated a later pre-Pottery Neolithic C period, which existed between 8,200 and 7,900 BP. Juris Zarins has proposed that a Circum-Arabian Nomadic Pastoral Complex developed in the period from the climatic crisis of 6,200 BC, partly as a result of an increasing emphasis in pre-pottery Neolithic B cultures upon animal domesticates, and a fusion with Harifian hunter-gatherers in southern Palestine with affiliated connections with the cultures of Phylum and the eastern desert of Egypt. Cultures practicing this lifestyle spread down the Red Sea shoreline and moved east from Syria into southern Iraq. Again, that kind of matches that migration of Semites. An-Gazel is a Neolithic archaeological site located in the metropolitan Amman, Jordan. The settlement at An-Gazel, Spring of the Gazelle, first appeared in the mid-pre-Pottery Neolithic B. And here's the kicker. Y DNA haplogroup E1B1B1B2 has been found in 75% of the An-Gazel population, along with 60% of pre-Pottery Neolithic B populations, and is present in all three stages of pre-Pottery B and in most Natufians. So haplogroup E basically played a huge role in the pre-Pottery populations, and of course in the Natufians. So when we're talking about Semites descending from PPNB populations, again, this gives more credence to these early Semitic populations having haplogroup E, if they're coming from PPNB, which had 60% of haplogroup E and 75% in the An-Gazel region, which is another pre-Pottery Neolithic site. So here is An-Gazel, by the way, in the Levant. And so now let's get into the Harifians, because we mentioned that earlier. So Harifian is a specialized regional culture developed of the Epipaleolithic of the Negev Desert. It corresponds to the last stage of the Natufian culture. So this is the last stage of the Natufian culture, the Harifian. Harifian has close connections to the late Mesolithic cultures of the Fayum and the eastern deserts of Egypt, whose tool assemblages resemble that of the Harifian. Fusion of animal domestication, elements of pre-Pottery Neolithic B culture, is hypothesized by Juris Zarins to have led to the Circum-Arabian Nomadic Pastoral Complex, a group of cultures that invented nomadic pastoralism. It may have been the original culture which spread Proto-Semitic languages throughout the region. So everything is culminating. The Harifians to the pre-Pottery Neolithic B to the Natufians in nomadic pastoralism. It is these peoples who originated Proto-Semitic languages and who spread Proto-Semitic languages. And all three of these peoples, the Harifians, the pre-Pottery Neolithic B, the Natufians, all being very similar fused people, one and the same, they all had haplogroup E. So here is the Harifian. Right here it will be in Sinai. And here's the late pre-Pottery, here's the late Natufian and the early PPNA. All of this is in the Levant. All of this is where Proto-Semitic would originate. And this fits exactly with what? The Proto-Semitic region, originating in 4000 BC. See, all of it is coming together. So, PPNB populations descend from Natufians. From PPNC populations would come PPNC, who are also the descendants of Natufians. And then the Harifian culture is the last stage of the Natufians, to whom Proto-Semites would come from. All of this fits perfectly with the spread of haplogroup E from the Levant into Mesopotamia. So again, I'm going to read what's in yellow. Thus, the origins of pastoral nomadicism must be sought in the context of mixed farming within the Fertile Crescent, especially during the PPNB. The Akkadians seem to have moved into the northern Arabian steppe and desert during the mid-7th millennium BC, the PPNC/PPNB populations apparently began intensive herding at the end of that period and maintained ties to the Fertile Crescent, both seen in both exotic trade and everyday culture. Archaeological sequences in the Arabian desert suggest that the Akkadians probably were of a West Semitic Levantine background, that is, from early pastoral nomadicism and the settlements of lower Mesopotamia. And again, reading what's in yellow, the evolution of agricultural in Southwest Asia generally follows a series of cultural transitions that begin with the Natufians, followed by the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A and Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, and then finally the development of pottery itself. The Natufians stand as an important cultural transition because they were the last hunter-gatherers in the Middle East. The Natufians appeared near the Sea of Galilee in what is now present-day Israel. That is from the Genetic Linguistic Inference. And here is the map showing the area of Natufian culture and the map showing the distribution of sites PPNB. So, the E1B1B branch is particular and mainly found in North Africans, Northeast Africans, and Middle Easterners, and was found in Egypt at 40%, the Jordan at 25%, Israel at 20%, Palestine at 20%, and Lebanon at 17.5%. There is still a decent frequency of haplogroup E in the Levant to this day. According to ancient DNA analysis conducted in 2016 by Losif Lazarus study and discussed in 2 articles the genetic structure of the world's first farmers, June 2016, and genomic insights into the origin of farming in the ancient Near East, July 2016, on the Natufian skeleton remains from present-day northern Israel. The remains of 5 Natufians carried the following paternal haplogroups, which of course is Y DNA haplogroup E. According to the genetic analysis done on 6 Natufian remains from northern Israel, the Natufians carried the Y DNA haplogroup E-Z830, a somewhat wide, open-wide clade of E-M123, and therefore ancestral to it. The Natufians were one of the first settled peoples in the world and may have contributed to the domestication of certain crops and thus the advent of agriculture, which is culminating together with everything we read earlier about the Harifians and such and the PPNB populations. The discovery of E-Z830 without other clades suggests an indigenous presence in Canaan and Israel and predates all other clades, which are not known to have existed in the region at the time, 10,000 years before present. So it's been there for a long time. And haplogroup E1B1B1B2 has been found in 75% of the Angazelle population, along with 60% of PPNB populations, circa 8,800 through 6,500 BC. Again, the ancestors of Semitic populations like the Akkadians. A study on population genomics of Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the Levant found in Selentep, one individual who lived circa 3369 through 3110 BC, who belonged to E-M84. A study on the population genomics of Bronze Age Eurasia found in the remains of Nerken Get Eshan in Armenia lived during the Middle Bronze Age to E-M84. A study on population genomics of Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the Levant found in the ancient city of Ebla, which is a Semitic city, during the Bronze Age, one male individual who is E-M84. A study on West Asian history in Nar Simhan at 2019 found several individuals who belong to E-Y31991 E-Y31991 in late Bronze Age / Early Iron Age samples in the Swat Valley, modern North Pakistan. And so you can kind of see an interesting timeline of these E markers. You see the oldest E markers in the Levant with the Natufians, of course, and then you see it in the N-Gazelle and the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, and then you begin to see it expand into places like Anatolia, places like the Levant and other parts of the Levant and the Fertile Crescent. We see it in Armenia, more in the Bronze Age, and then we see it in Ebla, a Semitic city in the northern part of the Levant. And we all see it all the way in northern Pakistan in the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. So we kind of see with these samples, basically, like I said, a timeline and a migration of these E markers, leaving, expanding from the Levant and going into the Fertile Crescent. And I find that to be very interesting. So here's just a map of the various E samples we find, and we see the expansion of it. And here is the area of Natufian culture, of course, where we find a lot of these old clades of E. And so I just want to show y'all all the clades of E that we found, or just, some of them. So we have N-Gazelle, PPNB. Like we said, this is where Semitic populations would come from, the PPNB populations. And then we have the Natufians, of course, over here. PPNB right here, Natufians right here. And then you have the Pekin Cave right here with the E sample, and in the middle, late Bronze Age period, in Hazor, you find E sample, Bronze Age. Megiddo, you find 2 E samples, and Tel Urdu, we find DE, and we find D or E, and Anatolia or Turkey, and we find E in Ebla, which is an ancient Semitic city. That's very interesting. We'll touch on that later. And we find E even all the way in Armenia in the Bronze Age. I believe this is the middle Bronze Age period. And a lot of people like to talk about Abraham coming from Armenia. Scriptures don't say that. But even hypothetically, if we were to say that Abraham came from Armenia, that alone wouldn't even discount him as being E, because we find E samples in Armenia. So E is a very widespread lineage, and it's definitely a Proto-Semitic lineage. It's very interesting where we see it everywhere. And this fits with the migration of Semites. We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin, 5,750 years ago, in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. And this fits with E. This is from How Eurasia Was Born, and it reads, the most plausible candidates for Semitic remigration to the Fertile Crescent, with TMRCAs fitting the arrival of the Akkadians and other early Semitic peoples, are certain subclades of both E-V22 and E-V12, with relatively early TMRCAs present in the Middle East, could be candidates for such remigration, such as E-FGC 14382, TMRCAs 2200 BC, and E-V3262, TMRCAs 2600 BCE. And this is from haplogroup J1. It's definitely not Semitic in origin, and it reads, according to the theory, Afro-Asiatic languages spread to Asia via E1b haplogroup, not J1 haplogroup. It is historically known that a ruling elite class of Afro-Asiatic people, Akkadians, Assyrians, etc., also invaded the north of Mesopotamia and brought their Afro-Asiatic languages to the central and northern parts of Mesopotamia during the period of Akkadians and Babylonians. Elite dominance model of E1b1 might be supposed for Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. In this sense, it might be theorized that Sumerian was the main language of ancient Mesopotamians before Afro-Asiatic E1b overwhelmed Mesopotamia, which is the elite dominance model. And that fits perfectly with this migration of of Proto-Semitic populations coming from the Levant into Mesopotamia. Before I play the clip, I want to make it known that I am protected under fair use. I'm using this video for teaching purposes as well as research purposes. I am protected under Title 17 USC Section 107. Again, this is a copyright disclaimer. I am protected under fair use. I'm using this video for teaching and research purposes. And of course, that video fits perfectly with the spread of haplogroup E, the oldest samples of haplogroup E being seen in the Levant and expanding from the Levant into Mesopotamia, much like how Proto-Semitic populations were expanding from the Levant into Mesopotamia and Arabia. So it all starts to fit perfectly. Therefore, an Arabian Levantine origin of Semites seems to be plausible. Early Semites would descend from Natufians, PPNB, and Harifian populations. They would have haplogroup E, and modern Arabians and Bedouin people would genetically be closest to the Proto-Semitic due to isolation. And I do see Arabians and Bedouins being the closest and the purest Semitic type, since they got isolated in the Arabian desert, unlike the other Semitic populations in Mesopotamia that would have mixed with other groups, Indo-Europeans, Hurrians, etc. Again, 3 of the individuals had Y chromosomes belonging to haplogroup E1b1. Natufian genomes also show similarity to modern-day populations in Saudi Arabia, as well as the Bedouin nomadic peoples of the Arabian Peninsula. These peoples are closest to the Natufians, and they have haplogroup E. And here's the distribution of Natufian DNA. As you can see, a very high percentage of it is in Arabia and expands outwards into Africa and the Mediterranean and such. So, but if Arabians and Bedouins are closest to, Proto-Semites, wouldn't that mean Proto-Semites had haplogroup J, since most Arabs today carry haplogroup J? No, that would be an oversimplification. Many people who speak Arabic today are not genetically Arabic. People who are true genetic Arabs would have a high amount of Natufian DNA and the old clades of E, the basal E that was in Arabia. Those would genetically be true Arabs, but there are a lot of people in Arabia with J markers who aren't Arab in origin. And this isn't just me saying this. This is Wikipedia saying this under the section haplogroup J1. And it reads, looking at the map of J1-P58, it is easy to assume that P58 is a marker of Arabic ancestry, but it reaches its maximum frequency in and around the Arabian Peninsula and would be an oversimplification. That would be an oversimplification. It is important to make a clear distinction between people who speak Arabic and those who are genetically Arabic. These are two completely different things. For comparison, people who speak languages descended from Latin, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian are not necessarily descended from the ancient Romans of the Latium. Even those who do may not have more than a tiny fraction of their genome which was inherited from actual Roman ancestors. This is why most Romance language speakers today cannot be considered as genetically Roman. Most present-day Arabic speakers outside of the Arabian Peninsula are likewise only very partially are not all Arabic genetically. In the northern half of the Middle East, most of the people who call themselves Arabs of today are in fact mainly descendants of other historic peoples, such as the Phoenicians, Assyrians, Babylonians, or even the Hurrians. And the Hurrians, like I always say, are a very important people to study. Check out my videos on the Hurrians. Most of these peoples are predominantly haplogroup J2, with many minor haplogroups like E1B1B, G, J1, L, Q, R1B, R1A, and T. The other subclades of J1 cannot be considered to be the paternal descendants of the first speakers of Arabic. I'm going to read that again. The other subclades of J1 cannot be considered to be the paternal descendants of the first speakers of Arabic. J1 is likely not the haplogroup of the first speakers of Arabic. These other J1 lineages were Arabicized alongside haplogroups J2, Q1b, etc. Like J1-P58, E-M34, it is also shared with their Semitic cousins, the Jews. Haplogroup E1B1B is considered the prime candidate for the origin and dispersal of Afro-Asiatic languages across northern and eastern Africa and Southwest Asia. The Semitic languages appear to have originated within a subclade of M34 branch of E1B1B. Genetically, we can see that there are two different peoples in the Middle East, not just with haplogroups such as E and J, but also with raw DNA data. One group of Middle Easterners with European/Anatolian ancestry, and another group of Middle Easterners with Natufian/African ancestry. But both Middle Eastern populations speak Semitic languages. This is from Levantines and Arabians have different origins, Middle East genomic studies find. Interesting. Moving on, Levantines and Iraqis share the same Neanderthal signatures as Eurasians, the team found. Arabians, on the other hand, have less Neanderthal DNA. Levantines have more ancestry than Arabians from Europe and Anatolia. So present-day Levantine populations today have more European and Anatolian DNA within them, or ancestry. The Arabians have more ancestry than Levantines from Africans who didn't mix with Neanderthals, and from Natufians, who were the prehistoric inhabitants of the Levant, including Israel. So Arabians are technically closer to the ancient Levantine populations, like the Natufians. Current day peoples by the way, I want to go back and just show you that there are clearly two different peoples living in the Middle East. One group of people who have more European and Anatolian ancestry, and one group who has more Natufian and African ancestry. So it's very interesting how you find two types in this land. Not all Middle Easterners are the same. Anyways, it says, current day peoples, the team studied in the Levant, Arabia, and Iraq turned out to form distinct core clusters. Populations from the Levant and Iraq, Lebanese, Syrians, Jordanians, Israeli Druze, and Iraqi Arabs clustered together. The Iraqi Kurds cluster with Central Iranians. Now that's very interesting. Iraqi Kurds cluster with Central Iranians, and of course Iranians are Indo-European people. The Arabians, the Emirates, Saudis, Yemenis, and Omanis cluster with Bedouins who are from Israel too, and that adds in your Bedouins as well. Arabians and Bedouins who are genetically close to each other and have a lot of Natufian DNA. Fascinatingly, both the Iraqi Kurds and Iranians who cluster together speak Indo-Iranian languages. Interesting. Which is an Indo-European language, which is non-Semitic. I'm going to repeat that again. Fascinatingly, both the Iraqi Kurds and Iranians who cluster together speak Indo-Iranian languages. Kurdish isn't Arabic or Semitic. The Kurdish language isn't Arabic or Semitic. It's Indo-Iranian, which is Indo-European. All the other people sampled in the study speak Arabic, a Semitic language. So basically you have people who are genetically Indo-Iranian related to people who speak Semitic languages. Why is that? It's very interesting. The clustering patterns we find reflects the historical ancestries present in modern-day populations. In the Levant, the Iraqi Arabs, all the populations we tested have higher Anatolian-like ancestry, which is much rarer in Arabia, so you don't find much Anatolian DNA in Arabia. Arabian populations, in contrast, have higher Natufian-like ancestry, Al-Mari says. And so, again, we see a clear contrast between two types of people in the Middle East, those with more Anatolian DNA and those with more Natufian DNA. And we see that many of these populations related to Semitic speakers more towards the north have an Iranian origin. I'm going to repeat that again up here. Fascinatingly, both the Iraqi Kurds and Iranians who cluster together speak Indo-Iranian languages. Kurdish isn't Arabic or Semitic, it's Indo-Iranian. All the other people sampled in the study speak Arabic, a Semitic language. So how and why are Arabic-speaking populations related to Iranian populations? Could it be because some of these peoples adopted the Arabic language and they're really genetically Iranian in origin? That's what seems to be the case. Now, we see that non-Semitic populations like Iraqi Kurds and Iranians who spoke Indo-Iranian languages are related to Semitic people that speak Arabic. What unites these non-Semitic and Semitic populations is their DNA, which is haplogroup J and Irano-Caucasian DNA. This brings us back to what I said earlier about people who speak Arabic today may not be genetically Arabian. Many of these modern Arabic speakers come from other peoples that had other type of origins towards the north. And just because haplogroup J is among these modern Arabic speakers doesn't mean that this is the progenitor of the Arabic language, which a lot of people seem to think. Again, what does EUpedia say? Looking at the map of J1-P58, it is easy to assume that P58 is a marker of Arabic ancestry, but because it reaches its maximum frequency in and around the Arabian Peninsula. That would be an oversimplification. Most present-day Arabic speakers outside the Arabian Peninsula are likewise only very partially or not all Arabic genetically. In the northern half of the Middle East, most of the people who call themselves Arabs of today are in fact mainly descendants of other historic peoples such as the Phoenicians, Assyrians, Babylonians, or even the Hurrians. And I put my money highly on the Hurrians. Most of these peoples are predominantly J2, with many minority haplogroups such as E1B1B, G, J1, L, Q, R1A, R1B, and T. And so what does this paper say? Current day peoples, the teams studied in the Levant, Arabia, and Iraq turned out to form distinct core clusters. Populations from the Levant and Iraq, Lebanese, Syrians, Jordanians, Israeli Druze, and Iraqi Arabs clustered together. The Iraqi Kurds clustered with Central Iranians. Iranians are Indo-Europeans. Fascinatingly, both the Iraqi Kurds and Iranians who clustered together speak Indo-Iranian languages. Kurdish isn't Arabic or Semitic, it's Indo-Iranian. All the other peoples sampled in the study speak Arabic, a Semitic language. So we see right here that people who speak the Arabic language are genetically tied to people who speak Indo-Iranian languages, like the Iraqi Kurds and actual Iranian people. So this goes to show you that a lot of the people who speak Arabic likely adopted the Arabic language and likely were Indo-Iranian speakers in origin before adopting Arabic. And that fits along with what this paper says, Edupedia. The other subclades of J1 cannot be considered to be the paternal descendants of the first speakers of Arabic. These other J1 lineages were Arabicized alongside other haplogroups J2, Q1b, etc. Like J1-P58, E-M34, it is also shared with their Semitic cousins, the Jews. Haplogroup E1b1b is considered the prime candidate for the origin and dispersal of Afro-Asiatic languages across northern and eastern Africa and Southwest Asia. The Semitic languages appear to have originated within a subclade of the M34 branch of E1b1b. Now, contrast this with Arabians and Bedouins, who have ancient Levantine ancestry and African ancestry. And of course, it still seems to be the case that Africans still influence Proto-Semitic genome. If Natufians are the ancestors of Semites, they had ancient North African Ibero-Maurusian DNA and East African DNA. Therefore, Arabians and Bedouins, who are the closest living descendants to the Natufians, still carry this basal North African DNA. It would seem like ancient North Africa and even East Africa played an important role in the genetic makeup of Proto-Semitic populations. Again, what is the breakdown of Natufian DNA? The Natufian sample consists of 61.2% Arabian, 21.2% North African, Ibero-Maurusian, 10.9% West Asian, and 6.8% Omotic, which is East African. And this is from projecting ancient ancestry in modern-day Arabians and Iranians. A key role of the past exposed Arabo-Persian Gulf on human populations, and reads, modern Saudi Arabian and Yemeni samples clustered tightly in the lower left quadrant, overlapping with the three Natufian samples, and were close to the Levant PPNB and PPNC. Remember what we said about the Harifians and Proto-Semites, and the Levant Bronze Age samples. So Arabians and Yemenis are closest to these samples. Therefore, they're closest to the Proto-Semitic peoples. A part of the modern UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Oman samples were more dispersed and mingled with North African Ibero-Maurusian and North African early Neolithic in accordance to some sub-Saharan input in their genomes. So again, we see even a North African influence in Arabians, likely also due to Natufians, as well as these populations going into that part of the world. And here's a chart just showing you Ibero-Maurusian and Natufian DNA in these Middle Eastern populations, specifically in Arabia. So we see in yellow, Yemen and Saudi Arabia have a high amount of Natufian DNA, and Oman and United Arab Emirates has a lot of Ibero-Maurusian DNA. And really both these populations share Ibero-Maurusian and Natufian DNA. You can see, depending on all these different charts, it's basically roughly the same. A lot of Natufian and Ibero-Maurusian in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. So Bedouins and Arabians may represent the purest Semitic types, in my opinion. To me, Bedouins and Arabians are also a good example of the early Semitic phenotypes. What is the phenotype of a Proto-Arabian, by the way? So this actually deals with the Arabian phenotype, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it reads, regarding the origin of the Arab. A third is the name Hamir or Dusky, a circumstance pointing, like the former, to African origin. The fourth is the Himyaritic language, are African in character, often in identity, Indeed, the dialect commonly used along the southeast coast hardly differs from that used by the Somali Africans on the opposite side. The pure Arabs differ from that of the north. Sixth, the pre-Islamic institutions of Yemen and its allied provinces, its monarchies, courts, armies, and serfs bears a marked resemblance to the historical Afro-Egyptian type, even to modern Abyssinia. Seventh, the physical conformation of the pure-blooded Arab inhabitants of Yemen, Hadranite, and Oman. The other particular point in an African rather than an Asiatic direction. Lastly, the extreme fertility of marriage which exists in all classes of the southern Arabians with the African race, the abundance of such unions and the slightness or even abundance of an caste feeling between the dusky, pure Arab and still darker native of modern Africa may be regarded as pointing to the direction of a community of origin. So basically they're saying that it would seem like Arabians have like an African phenotype in them. This is from the book The Arabs by Bertram Thomas, and it reads, the original inhabitants of Arabia, then according to Sir Arthur Keith, one of the world's greatest living anthropologists, who has made a study of the Arab skeletal remains, ancient and modern, were not the familiar Arabs of our time, but a very much darker people. The Proto-Negroid belt of mankind stretched across the ancient world from Africa to Malaysia, giving rise to the Hamitic peoples of Africa, to the Dravidian peoples of India, and to the intermediate dark people inhabiting the Arabian Peninsula. So Arabia was once extremely dark-skinned. It had a more African look to them. But things changed when the fair people came in. So I'm going to read what's in blue. In the course of time, two big migrations of fair-skinned peoples came from the north, one of them the Mongoloids, to break through and transform the dark belt of mankind beyond India, and the other the Caucasoids, to drive a wedge between India and Africa. The more vile invaders overcame the dark-skinned peoples, absorbing most of them, driving others southwards, where my own exploration is believed to have discovered vestiges of them in the natural sanctuary beyond the great sand ocean of Rub al-Khali. And so I believe that this would be the J markers, by the way, coming in and absorbing a lot of the dark-skinned peoples who would have had E markers. But here's another two other sources that detail that early Arabian populations were dark-skinned. They looked more like Dravidian or Somali people. This is from Henry Field in his Ancient and Modern Man in Southwest Asia, and it reads, Dravidian and Arab have in them an inheritance of a common stock. So he believes that Dravidians and Arabs kind of come from the same people. An inheritance which has been retained more completely by the natives of India than by the people of Arabia. So if you look at the more native people of India, that's what he believes the people the Arabians would mostly look like. And over here is actually old depictions or pictures of Dravidian peoples from south of India. And then you have Marshall's and Van Verveel's remarkable insight has the support of contemporary ethology and modern genetic research. Sir Arthur Keith and Dr. Wilton Moran Corgan, in their discussion of the racial characteristics of the southern Arabs, it reads, the Arabian Peninsula was at one time occupied by people intermediate to the Somalis on one hand and to the Dravidians of India on the other hand. So again, Somalis and Dravidians, a good example of a more ancient Arabian phenotype, which I believe that if Arabians or Bedouins represent the most basal Semitic population, then that's kind of how Proto-Semites would look like. They perhaps could have looked like Arabs, which therefore would mean they perhaps would have looked like a Dravidian or Somali type of phenotype. This is from The Negro in the New World, which also details how early Arabia looked. It is quite convincible that the great peninsula of Arabia was once populated as far as its natural conditions allowed by a primitive Negro stock, which may have been later or partially exterminated by changing of unfavorable conditions of climate and by the aftercoming of the white man and his type. Of course, I feel like that'll be the J markers. But here's just a bunch of different images of Bedouins and Arabians and various peoples in the Arabian Peninsula. This is how I believe ancient Proto-Semitic people would have looked like if they had a more Levantine Arabian origin. They basically would look like dark-skinned Arabians and Bedouins. It's the best example I think I can give. So these Arabians, Bedouins, and Yemeni people are perhaps good examples of the Proto-Semitic phenotype. But this is where we end the Arabian Peninsula Natufian origin of Semites. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe, share the video, click the bell, leave a comment for any questions you might have, and follow my social media platforms for more information. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.